Homeless girl sits at wrong table on blind date, never realized. He's a secret millionaire and falls in love. What happened next will shock you. A simple mix-up that changed two lives forever. If you enjoy this heart-touching story, please like, share, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The rain poured mercilessly as Sarah Hale, huddled under the awning of a closed bookstore, clutching her tattered jacket tighter around her slender frame. Her dark hair, usually carefully maintained despite her circumstances, hung in damp strands around her face. She checked her phone, a basic model she had managed to keep charged at the shelter, and squinted at the time. 6:45 p.m. She was going to be late. "Come on, Sarah," she muttered to herself. "It's just a blind date. The worst that can happen is you don't get the job." That wasn't entirely true. The worst that could happen was that she would spend another night trying to find a safe corner in the shelter, surrounded by strangers whose stories were as painful as her own. But Marissa, the kind-hearted social worker who had been helping Sarah for months, had arranged this date with someone who might be able to offer her employment. It was too important to miss. The restaurant Bellissimo stood at the corner of the street, its warm light spilling onto the wet pavement. It was much too fancy for someone like her, but Marissa had insisted, saying her date would be picking up the tab. Sarah had spent hours at the shelter's bathroom sink that morning, washing her single decent outfit. Black pants and a simple blue blouse she'd received from a clothing drive. She'd carefully applied the minimal makeup she owned, determined to look presentable, employable. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped into the rain, making a dash for the restaurant entrance. By the time she reached it, her shoes were soaked through and her blouse had dark patches of moisture. The hostess at the entrance gave her a skeptical once-over. "May I help you?" she asked, barely concealing her disdain. "I'm here for a meeting," Sarah said, trying to sound confident despite the water dripping from her hair. "My name is Serafina Hale." The hostess scanned her tablet, her perfectly arched eyebrows rising slightly. "Yes, we have a reservation for Mr. Reynolds, who mentioned he would be meeting a Serafina. Table 12, by the window." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. At least her date had actually made the reservation. She followed the hostess into the warm, elegant space, feeling painfully out of place among the crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. Each table was set with gleaming silverware and delicate wine glasses, occupied by people whose clothes probably cost more than everything Sarah had ever owned. "Table 12, the hostess said, gesturing vaguely toward the window before turning away. Sarah scanned the area, her heart racing. She spotted a man sitting alone at a table near the large windows that overlooked the city. He was focused on his phone, his face illuminated by its glow. With another deep breath, she approached, rehearsing her introduction in her head. The man didn't look up as she neared the table. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His dark hair was cut short on the sides, but slightly longer on top, styled with just enough product to look effortless. Sarah hesitated, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must appear. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" He looked up, and Sarah felt her breath catch. His eyes were a striking shade of blue-gray, framed by dark lashes. He had the kind of face that belonged on billboards, strong jawline, straight nose, and full lips that quirked up slightly at one corner. "I am," he replied, his voice deep and smooth. "I'm Serafina Hale," she said, extending her hand despite her nerves. "But everyone calls me Sarah." The man blinked, surprise flickering across his features, before being replaced by something like curiosity. He stood towering over her at well over 6 feet and took her hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. As Sarah took her seat, she noticed he hadn't introduced himself. Maybe this was some kind of test? Marissa had mentioned he was in business and might be able to offer her an entry-level position. Perhaps he was evaluating her social skills. "I'm sorry I'm a bit late," she said, trying to smooth her damp hair. "The rain caught me by surprise." "No problem at all," he replied, studying her with those intense eyes. "Would you like something to drink, to warm up?" "Just water is fine," Sarah said quickly. She couldn't afford to spend money on alcohol, and she needed to keep a clear head. This meeting could change her life. The man raised a hand, and immediately a waiter appeared at their table. "A glass of water for the lady," he said, "and I'll have another scotch. The Macallan 18, neat." The waiter nodded and disappeared. Sarah fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, trying to think of something impressive to say. "So," the man said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "this is unexpected." Sarah's face heated. Of course, he'd expected someone more polished, not someone who looked like she'd been caught in a rainstorm. "I'm sorry about my appearance. I don't usually look quite this disheveled." A smile tugged at his lips. "No need to apologize. I simply meant that you're not who I was expecting to meet tonight." "Oh?" Sarah felt a flicker of confusion. "Marissa didn't tell you about me?" "Marissa?" The man's eyebrows drew together. "I don't believe I know a Marissa." Now it was Sarah's turn to be confused. "My social worker? She arranged this meeting? Said you might be able to help me find a job?" The man's expression cleared, and suddenly he laughed, a rich, warm sound that made Sarah's stomach flip despite her growing embarrassment. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm waiting for a business associate to discuss a potential acquisition. But," he paused, studying her for a moment, "I'm Cassian Vance." Cassian Vance. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the way he said it suggested it should. She felt her face flush deeper. "I'm so sorry," she said, already rising from her chair. "I must have the wrong table. The hostess said table 12, but I must have misheard." "No, this is table 12, Cassian said, gesturing for her to sit back down. "It seems the restaurant has made a mistake, but since you're already here, why don't you join me for dinner? My associate is apparently running late anyway." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to flee, to escape this humiliating situation. But something about Cassian's expression, curious, amused, but not mocking, made her pause. "I couldn't impose," she said weakly. "It's not an imposition," Cassian replied smoothly. "I'd enjoy the company, and who knows, perhaps I can help with your job search after all." Against her better judgment, Sarah sank back into her chair. The waiter returned with their drinks, and Cassian immediately ordered appetizers for the table without consulting the menu. "So, Serafina Hale," he said, taking a sip of his scotch. "Tell me about yourself." Sarah wrapped her fingers around her water glass, grateful for something to hold on to. "There's not much to tell. I've had some setbacks recently. I'm staying at the Hope Street shelter until I can get back on my feet." She waited for the usual reaction, pity, discomfort, sometimes disgust. But Cassian's expression didn't change. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked instead. "Honestly, anything," Sarah admitted. "I have a degree in fine arts, but that doesn't exactly open a lot of doors. I've done office work, customer service. I'm a quick learner." Cassian nodded thoughtfully. "What happened?" "If you don't mind my asking." Sarah took a sip of water, wondering how much to share. "Medical bills," she said finally. "My mother got sick, cancer. We didn't have insurance. By the time she passed away, I'd lost our apartment, sold everything of value. It's been difficult to climb back out of that hole." She braced herself for platitudes, for the conversation to turn awkward. Instead, Cassian simply nodded. "I understand more than you might think," he said quietly. Before he could elaborate, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then back at Sarah. "It seems my business associate has been delayed even further. Shall we order dinner?" The evening took on a dreamlike quality as Cassian ordered course after course, encouraging Sarah to try foods she'd never even heard of. He asked questions about her life, her education, her dreams, and actually seemed interested in her answers. He was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that made her laugh despite her initial embarrassment. "So, what exactly do you do, Mr. Vance?" Sarah asked as they shared a decadent chocolate dessert. "Cassian, please," he corrected. "I'm in tech, software development primarily." "That sounds complicated," Sarah said, immediately feeling foolish. Cassian smiled. "It can be, but it's also rewarding. Creating solutions to problems, building something from nothing but an idea." "Like art," Sarah said without thinking. Cassian's eyes brightened. "Exactly like art. You mentioned a fine arts degree. What's your medium?" "Drawing mostly, charcoal, pencil. I used to paint, but..." She shrugged. "Art supplies are expensive." "I'd like to see your work sometime," Cassian said, and somehow Sarah believed he meant it. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to this mysterious man. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and there was a depth to him that intrigued her. She almost forgot that this wasn't actually her blind date, that she was essentially having dinner with a stranger. That reminder came in the form of a text message that buzzed on her phone as they were finishing their coffee. "I'm at Bellissimo, table 23. Where are you? Marcus Reynolds." Sarah stared at the message in horror. "Oh my God." "What's wrong?" Cassian asked, concern evident in his voice. "My actual blind date. He's here. He's been waiting at table 23. Sarah stood up so quickly she almost knocked over her chair. "I'm so sorry. I have to go. Thank you for dinner. It was—" "Sarah, wait," Cassian said, standing as well. "Let me give you my card, in case you—" But Sarah was already backing away. "I'm sorry. I can't believe I made such a mistake. I have to go." She turned and hurried through the restaurant, mortification burning through her. How could she have spent the entire evening with the wrong man? What must Cassian think of her? And now she'd kept her actual contact waiting, possibly ruining her chance at employment. She found table 23 on the opposite side of the restaurant. A balding man in his 50s sat there, checking his watch with an irritated expression. "Mr. Reynolds?" she asked tentatively. The man looked up, his face hard. "You must be Serafina. You're over an hour late." "I'm so sorry. There was a mix-up with the tables," Sarah began, but Mr. Reynolds cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Save it. Marissa spoke highly of you, but I don't hire people who can't even show up on time for an interview. Good evening." With that, he stood, threw some bills on the table, and walked past her without another glance. Sarah stood there, frozen, as the significance of what had just happened washed over her. She'd blown it. Her chance at a job, at climbing out of homelessness, gone because she'd sat at the wrong table. She made her way back to table 12, hoping to at least properly thank Cassian for the dinner, but the table was empty. The bill had been paid, and Cassian Vance was gone. As Sarah stepped back out into the rainy night, she had no way of knowing that across the city, in a penthouse apartment with a view of the skyline, Cassian Vance was instructing his assistant to find out everything they could about a homeless artist named Serafina Hale. Back at the shelter that night, Sarah curled up on her narrow cot, replaying the evening in her mind. Despite the disastrous ending, she couldn't help smiling as she remembered Cassian's laugh, the way his eyes had lit up when she'd compared programming to art. For a few hours, she'd forgotten about her circumstances, about the constant weight of poverty and uncertainty. For a few hours, she'd felt seen. What she didn't know was that tomorrow her world would change again, when a chance encounter would bring Cassian Vance back into her life and reveal truths that would both frighten and fascinate her. 3 days later, Sarah huddled in the doorway of a closed boutique, trying to stay dry as rain once again poured from the gray sky. She'd spent the morning going from business to business, asking if they were hiring, only to be met with polite rejection after polite rejection. Her last attempt had been at a small coffee shop, where the manager had at least taken her application, though his expression made it clear her chances were slim. Now, with the sky darkening as evening approached, she needed to get back to the shelter before dinner ended. Missing a meal wasn't an option. She'd already lost too much weight in the past months. But the rain showed no signs of letting up, and she'd forgotten her umbrella at the shelter. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb in front of her, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Sarah stepped further back into the doorway, making herself smaller. Years on the streets had taught her to be wary of expensive cars showing interest in young women. The back window rolled down, and Sarah's heart leapt to her throat. Cassian Vance sat in the back seat, looking even more striking than she remembered. "Serafina," he called over the sound of the rain. "Is that you?" Sarah hesitated, then stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Vance. Hello?" "Cassian," he corrected, smiling that same warm smile that had disarmed her at dinner. "What a coincidence. Can I offer you a ride somewhere?" Every warning bell in Sarah's mind went off at once. Getting into cars with men she barely knew, even charming, handsome men who bought her expensive dinners, was dangerous. But the rain was coming down harder now, and the thought of walking another mile to the shelter was daunting. "That's very kind," she said cautiously, "but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." "No inconvenience at all," Cassian said, opening the door wider. "Please, I insist. This weather is brutal. Against her better judgment, Sarah slid into the back seat, immediately aware of how out of place she was in the luxurious interior. The seats were soft leather, and the car smelled of expensive cologne and new upholstery. Cassian sat across from her, giving her space, which she appreciated. "Where can I take you?" he asked. "The Hope Street shelter," Sarah replied, trying not to feel embarrassed. "It's about a mile east of here." Cassian nodded and pressed a button, speaking to the driver. "Hope Street shelter, please, James." The car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the rain-slicked streets. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle purr of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. "I wanted to apologize for the other night," Cassian finally said. "I should have been clearer about the misunderstanding sooner." Sarah shook her head. "No, I'm the one who should apologize. I sat at your table, took up your evening, and then rushed out without even a proper thank you." "It was one of the more enjoyable evenings I've had in a long time," Cassian said, his voice sincere. "I'm glad you sat at the wrong table." Sarah felt warmth spreading across her cheeks. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth," Cassian replied simply. Did your actual meeting go well?" Sarah's smile faded. "Not exactly. Mr. Reynolds wasn't impressed by my tardiness." "His loss," Cassian said firmly. Then, after a brief hesitation, "I might be able to help. With a job, I mean." Sarah's heart skipped. "You mentioned you're in tech. I don't have any experience in that field." "Not directly with my company," Cassian said, "but I know the cafe next to my office building is hiring. The owner is a friend of mine. I could put in a good word." Hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed in Sarah's chest. "You would do that? For a stranger?" Cassian's eyes met hers, serious and intense. "You don't feel like a stranger, Serafina?" The car slowed to a stop, and Sarah realized they had arrived at the shelter. The plain brick building looked even more depressing in the rain, a stark contrast to the luxury of Cassian's car. "Thank you for the ride," she said softly, "and for the offer. I would be very grateful for any help." Cassian pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "The cafe is called The Daily Grind on 5th and Pine. Ask for Tessa, the manager. Go tomorrow morning around 9. I'll let her know to expect you." Sarah took the card, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt of electricity seemed to pass between them at the contact, and she quickly pulled her hand away. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, clutching the card like a lifeline. "Just show up," Cassian replied with a smile. "That's all the thanks I need." As Sarah stepped out of the car and hurried through the rain to the shelter entrance, she had no idea that the Daily Grind, like the entire office building beside it, was owned by Cassian Vance. She had no idea that the man who had just offered her a chance at employment was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And she had no idea that Cassian had instructed his driver to take a detour past the cafe that morning, hoping for exactly the coincidence that had just occurred. All she knew was that for the first time in months, she felt something that had become foreign to her. Hope. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to yesterday's downpour. Sarah woke before the shelter's alarm, her mind already racing with thoughts of the job opportunity. She dressed carefully in her cleanest clothes, the same outfit she'd worn to the restaurant, now dried and pressed as best she could manage with the shelter's communal iron. She brushed her hair until it shone and applied a touch of mascara and lip balm she'd been saving for special occasions. "Going somewhere important?" asked Eliza, an elderly woman who occupied the cot next to Sarah's. "A job interview," Sarah replied, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "At a cafe downtown." Eliza patted her hand. "You look lovely, dear. Good luck." Sarah left the shelter an hour early, wanting to make sure she had plenty of time to find the cafe. The address Cassian had given her led her to a gleaming skyscraper that dominated the skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Nestled at its base was a charming cafe, with a wooden sign that read, "The Daily Grind," in elegant script. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the door. The cafe was busy with the morning rush, filled with people in business attire grabbing coffee before heading to their offices. The scent of freshly ground beans and baked goods filled the air, making Sarah's stomach rumble. She'd been too nervous to eat breakfast at the shelter. She approached the counter where a woman in her 40s with curly red hair was efficiently managing the line of customers. "Excuse me," Sarah said when there was a brief lull. "Are you Tessa?" "I'm Serafina Hale. I was told you might have a position available." The woman's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Ah, yes. Mr. Vance mentioned you might stop by. Can you wait about 20 minutes until this rush dies down? Then we can chat." Sarah nodded, stepping away from the counter. She found a small table in the corner and sat down, watching the efficient ballet of the cafe staff as they prepared and served orders. Her mind was racing. Mr. Vance? So Cassian was important enough that the cafe manager referred to him formally. Maybe he was a regular customer, or perhaps he worked in the towering building next door. After exactly 20 minutes, Tessa approached Sarah's table with 2 steaming mugs. She set one in front of Sarah. "Hot chocolate," she said with a warm smile. "Best thing for job interview nerves." Sarah returned the smile gratefully. "Thank you." Tessa sat down across from her. "So, Mr. Vance says you're looking for work. Any experience in food service?" "I worked at a campus coffee shop during college," Sarah replied, "and I've done customer service at a department store." Tessa nodded, taking a sip of her drink. "Well, I do need someone for the morning shift, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's busy work. We get all the employees from the building next door. The pay is decent, plus tips, and there's a meal included each shift." Sarah's heart leapt. A steady job, regular meals. It was more than she'd dared to hope for. "That sounds perfect. There's just one problem," Tessa said, her expression turning serious. "I need someone who can start tomorrow, and employees need to have a fixed address for tax purposes." Sarah's hope dimmed. "I'm currently staying at the Hope Street shelter," she admitted. "I don't have a permanent address yet." To her surprise, Tessa didn't look put off. "I thought that might be the case. Mr. Vance mentioned you've had some difficulties. As it happens, there's a small studio apartment above the cafe that used to be for storage. It's nothing fancy, but it has a bathroom and kitchenette. Part of your compensation could be living there, if you're interested." Sarah stared at her, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Are you serious?" Tessa smiled. "Completely serious. Mr. Vance suggested the arrangement. He said something about giving people a chance to get back on their feet." "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "Why would he do this for me? We barely know each other." Tessa shrugged. "He's like that sometimes. Sees potential in people. So, are you interested?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." "Good," Tessa replied, standing. "Let me show you the apartment, and then we can fill out the paperwork." The apartment was small, as Tessa had warned, but to Sarah, it was perfect. A single room with a bed, a small table with 2 chairs, a kitchenette in one corner, and a tiny bathroom. The windows overlooked a quiet side street, letting in plenty of natural light. It was clean, functional, and most importantly, it was private, something Sarah hadn't experienced in months. "I can't believe this," she whispered, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It's yours if you want it," Tessa said. "We'll deduct a small amount from your pay for rent, but you'll still make enough to save up. And once you're on your feet, you can find somewhere else if you prefer." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem enough." "Thank Mr. Vance," Tessa replied with a smile. "This was his idea. Now, let's go back downstairs and get your paperwork sorted out. You can move in today if you like, and start work tomorrow." By that evening, Sarah had collected her few possessions from the shelter and moved into her new home. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in disbelief at how quickly her life had changed, from homeless to employed with her own apartment in less than 24 hours, all because she'd accidentally sat at the wrong table at a restaurant. She pulled out her phone and the business card Cassian had given her. After hesitating for a moment, she sent a text to the number listed. "Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have right now. So, thank you truly. Sarah." She didn't expect an immediate response, but her phone buzzed less than a minute later. "You're welcome. Looking forward to seeing what you do with this opportunity." Sarah smiled, tucking the phone away. Tomorrow would be the start of a new chapter in her life, and she was determined to make the most of it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Sarah settled into her new routine. She worked hard at the cafe, quickly learning the regulars' orders and becoming adept at creating intricate latte art. The customers appreciated her warm smile and genuine interest in their lives, and her tip jar grew steadily fuller. She loved the work. The fast pace kept her mind busy, and the constant interaction with people eased the loneliness she'd felt at the shelter. Every morning, men and women in expensive suits streamed in from the gleaming office tower next door, ordering complex coffee creations and pastries to fuel their workdays. Sarah often wondered if Cassian was among them, but she never saw him. After a couple of weeks, she worked up the courage to ask Tessa about him. "Mr. Vance? Oh, he rarely comes in through the main entrance," Tessa explained as they prepared for the morning rush. "The executives have their own private elevator on the other side of the building." "So he works in the tower?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casual as she arranged pastries in the display case. Tessa gave her an odd look. "You could say that." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the morning rush began, and the conversation was forgotten in the flurry of orders and customers. One slow afternoon, when the cafe was nearly empty, Sarah found herself doodling on a napkin while waiting for customers. Without really thinking about it, she sketched the profile of a businessman who had been a regular at her counter, capturing his distinctive nose and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "That's incredible," said a voice over her shoulder, making Sarah jump. It was the man himself, peering at her drawing with obvious delight. "It's me," Sarah blushed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" No, it's wonderful," he insisted. "I didn't know you were an artist. Would you mind if I kept it?" Flustered, Sarah handed him the napkin. "It's just a sketch." "It's talent," he corrected, examining the drawing more closely. "Raw talent." The next day, the man returned with 3 of his colleagues. "This is the artist I was telling you about," he announced proudly, pointing to Sarah. "She captured my likeness perfectly on a cafe napkin." Sarah found herself sketching all 4 of them, much to their delight. By the end of the week, word had spread, and customers were asking if she would draw them while they waited for their coffee. Tessa, seeing an opportunity, set up a small sign on the counter. "Portrait sketches by Sarah, $5. To Sarah's amazement, people were happy to pay for her quick sketches. Some days, she made almost as much from her art as from her regular pay. For the first time since her mother's illness, she was using her artistic skills again, and being appreciated for them. One evening, as Sarah was closing up the cafe, Tessa approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Your drawings are bringing in a lot of new customers," she said. "People are coming specifically to be sketched by you." Sarah smiled, wiping down the counter. "It's fun for me, too. I've missed drawing." "I was thinking," Tessa continued, "we could display some of your work on the walls, proper pieces, not just the quick sketches. We could even sell them, if you're interested." Sarah's hands stilled. "I don't have any supplies, paper, charcoal, frames." "Consider it an investment on my part," Tessa said with a wave of her hand. "I'll provide what you need, and we'll split the profits from any sales. What do you say?" That night, Sarah stayed up late in her little apartment, working on her first proper drawing in over a year. Using the high-quality paper and charcoal Tessa had given her, she created a detailed portrait of the cafe during the morning rush. Customers waiting in line, baristas in motion, steam rising from cups. She lost herself in the familiar, comforting rhythm of creation, feeling more alive than she had in months. 2 weeks later, the cafe walls held 6 of Sarah's pieces: cityscapes, cafe scenes, and portraits of regular customers. To her shock and delight, 3 sold within the first week. The customers raved about her talent, and Tessa couldn't have been happier with the increased business. What Sarah didn't know was that Cassian Vance had purchased all 3 pieces through intermediaries. Nor did she know that he regularly watched the cafe's security feeds from his office on the top floor of the tower, observing her progress from afar. One rainy evening, almost 2 months after starting at the daily grind, Sarah was walking home from the art supply store with a fresh batch of materials when she spotted a familiar figure huddled in a doorway across the street. It was Eliza from the shelter, clutching a thin plastic bag of possessions, looking even more frail than Sarah remembered. Without hesitation, Sarah crossed the street. "Eliza, are you okay?" The elderly woman looked up, her face lighting with recognition. "Serafina! Oh, it's good to see you, dear." "What happened? Why aren't you at the shelter?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. "They're at capacity," Eliza explained wearily. "They're giving priority to families with children. I was told to try again tomorrow. Sarah made an immediate decision. Come with me. You can stay in my place tonight. I couldn't impose, Eliza began, but Sarah cut her off. It's not an imposition. Someone helped me when I needed it most. Now I can do the same for you. That night, Sarah gave Eliza the bed and made herself comfortable on a pile of blankets on the floor. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about how quickly fortunes could change, both for better and worse. The next morning, Sarah woke early and slipped out to start her shift at the cafe, leaving Eliza sleeping peacefully. During a quiet moment, she approached Tessa. I need to ask a huge favor, she began hesitantly. My friend from the shelter needs a place to stay, just until there's room for her to go back. She's elderly and has nowhere else to go. Would it be okay if she stayed with me for a few days? Tessa's expression softened. Of course. And actually, I've been thinking we could use some extra help around here, especially with the lunch crowd. Do you think your friend might be interested in a part-time position? Sarah stared at her, a lump forming in her throat. Tessa, she would be so grateful. Thank you. Tessa smiled, patting Sarah's hand. We all need a helping hand sometimes. Later that day, as Sarah was serving a customer, the cafe door opened and a tall figure entered. Her breath caught as she recognized Cassian Vance, even more handsome than she remembered in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He paused just inside the door, scanning the room until his eyes found hers. A smile spread across his face as he approached the counter. Hello, Serafina, he said, his voice sending a flutter through her chest. I see you took the job. Mr. Vance, she replied, suddenly aware of how she must look in her cafe uniform, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Yes, thanks to you. Please, it's Cassian, he corrected. And how is it working out? Better than I could have imagined, Sarah said honestly. Tessa has been amazing. And the apartment? I don't know how to thank you for that. Cassian waved away her thanks. I just provided an opportunity. You're the one making the most of it. His eyes drifted to the walls where her artwork hung. These are remarkable. Your talent is evident. Sarah blushed under his praise. Thank you. It feels good to be drawing again. I was hoping to buy one, actually, Cassian said, examining a cityscape she'd recently completed. This one, if it's for sale. Of course, Sarah replied, trying to hide her excitement. I can wrap it for you after my shift. Perfect, Cassian said. I'll come back around closing time, if that works for you. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. I'll be here. As Cassian turned to leave, Tessa emerged from the back room, her eyes widening at the sight of him. Mr. Vance? What a surprise, she exclaimed, hurrying over. Can I get you anything? Just stopping by to check on your newest employee, Cassian replied with a smile. Seems like things are working out well. She's a godsend, Tessa said, beaming at Sarah. Best hire I've made in years. After Cassian left, Sarah turned to Tessa, curiosity burning in her eyes. How do you know him? Does he work in the building? Tessa gave her an incredulous look. You really don't know who he is, do you? Sarah shook her head, confusion written across her face. Serafina, Tessa said slowly. Cassian Vance doesn't just work in the building. He owns it, and this cafe, and about a dozen other properties across the city. He's the founder and CEO of Vance Technologies. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. What? He's one of the wealthiest men in the city, Tessa continued, watching Sarah's expression with growing concern. Self-made tech millionaire. Surely you've heard of him? No, Sarah whispered, her mind reeling. I had no idea. Suddenly everything made sense. The expensive suit, the chauffeur-driven car, the way he could casually offer her a job and an apartment. But one thing still didn't make sense. Why had he taken such an interest in helping her? As the realization sank in, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for his help, yes, but also embarrassment that she hadn't recognized who he was, and a nagging suspicion about his motives. Rich people didn't help strangers without expecting something in return. That was a lesson her mother's illness had taught her all too well. By the time closing came around, Sarah had worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation. When the bell above the door jingled and Cassian walked in, she had the cityscape wrapped and ready, but her easy smile from earlier had been replaced by a guarded expression. Is something wrong? Cassian asked, immediately noticing the change. Why didn't you tell me who you are? Sarah asked directly. sliding the wrapped artwork across the counter toward him. Cassian's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. Would it have mattered? Of course it would have mattered, Sarah replied, keeping her voice low despite the empty cafe. You're not just some guy who works in an office building. You own half the block, including this cafe. Does that change how you feel about the help I offered? Cassian asked, his tone genuinely curious. Sarah hesitated. Did it? The job and apartment had been life-changing, but knowing they came from a millionaire, someone who could give away such things without even noticing their absence, somehow made them feel different, less like earned opportunities and more like charity. I don't know, she admitted finally. I just wish you'd been honest with me. Cassian nodded slowly. That's fair. I apologize for the omission. In my defense, it's refreshing to meet someone who doesn't know who I am or what I have. Someone who treats me like a regular person. Is that why you helped me? Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind. Because I didn't recognize you. I helped you because you needed help, Cassian said simply. And because I saw something in you worth investing in. Your resilience, your talent. He gestured to the wrapped artwork. I wasn't lying about wanting to buy this, by the way. It's extraordinary. Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to be angry that he'd kept such a significant detail from her, but another part understood his desire for normalcy, and regardless of his wealth or position, she couldn't deny that he'd changed her life for the better. Well, she said finally, now that I know who you are, Mr. Vance, will you still be coming by the cafe? A slow smile spread across Cassian's face. Only if you promise to stop calling me Mr. Vance. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet, removing several crisp bills. How much for the artwork? $200, Sarah said, the price they'd agreed on with Tessa for the larger pieces. Without hesitation, Cassian placed $500 bills on the counter. It's worth every penny. That's too much, Sarah protested. It's what I would have paid in any gallery in the city, Cassian replied firmly. Please don't undervalue your work, Serafina. As Sarah reluctantly accepted the money, their fingers brushed, sending that same electric jolt through her that she'd felt in his car. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sarah forgot about his wealth, his status, everything except the intense connection she felt to this man. Would you have dinner with me again? Cassian asked softly. Not by accident this time, but as a proper date? Sarah hesitated. Dating a millionaire was never part of her plan for getting back on her feet. It complicated everything. And yet, I'd like that, she heard herself say. But this time, I choose the restaurant. Somewhere normal people go. Cassian's laugh was warm and genuine. It's a deal. As he left with her artwork tucked carefully under his arm, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into uncharted territory. A world where millionaires bought coffee shop artwork for 5 times its asking price and asked homeless artists on dates. What she didn't know was that back in his penthouse office, Cassian's assistant was warning him about the dangers of getting personally involved with someone like Sarah. You're playing with fire, she cautioned as Cassian hung the cityscape on his office wall. Your board won't like it. The press will have a field day. I don't care, Cassian replied, stepping back to admire Sarah's work. There's something about her, Helen, something real in a world of fakeness. Little did either of them know that their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could anticipate, where wealth and poverty, truth and lies, charity and pride would create a perfect storm of complications. And at the center of it all, a talented artist who had accidentally sat at the wrong table, changing the course of 2 lives forever. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Her artwork gained popularity at the cafe, with customers often requesting specific pieces or commissioning portraits. Tessa had expanded the wall space dedicated to her drawings, and Sarah found herself spending most evenings in her small apartment, creating new pieces to meet the demand. What she didn't know was that Cassian had quietly spread the word about her talent among his wealthy friends and business associates, encouraging them to visit the cafe and purchase her work. He never told her about his behind-the-scenes support, wanting her success to feel earned rather than given. Their first official date had been at a small Italian restaurant in a modest neighborhood, Sarah's choice, as promised. Cassian had arrived without his chauffeur, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt that still somehow looked expensive. They'd talked for hours about art and technology, dreams and disappointments. By the end of the evening, Sarah had almost forgotten about the vast gap in their circumstances. Almost, but not quite. The knowledge of his wealth and position hovered at the edges of her consciousness, a persistent reminder that they came from different worlds. Still, they continued to see each other. Cassian would stop by the cafe during quiet moments, sometimes bringing her small gifts, a set of professional drawing pencils, a book about an artist she admired, never anything flashy or obviously expensive. They would meet for dinner once or twice a week, always at places Sarah chose, always with Cassian paying, but never making a show of it. Meanwhile, Sarah's financial situation steadily improved. Between her cafe salary, tips, and art sales, she was able to save money for the first time since her mother's illness. She opened a bank account, bought some new clothes, and even sent a small donation to the Hope Street shelter. One morning, as she was preparing for her shift, a letter arrived at her apartment. It was from the debt collection agency that had been hounding her about her mother's medical bills. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it, expecting another demand for payment she couldn't afford. Instead, she found a statement indicating that her debt had been paid in full. Sarah stared at the paper in disbelief. It had to be a mistake. The amount was over $30,000, money she certainly didn't have. She immediately called the agency, prepared to explain the error. "No, Ms. Hale, there's no mistake," the representative assured her. "Your debt was settled in full last Tuesday." "By whom?" Sarah demanded. "I'm afraid that information is confidential. The payment was made with the condition of anonymity." Sarah thanked the representative and hung up, her mind racing. She knew instantly who was responsible. Only one person in her life had both the means and the motive to pay off her debt: Cassian. Her initial reaction was relief, followed quickly by anger. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it. The debt was hers to bear, her responsibility. Who was he to sweep in and erase it without even asking her? When she arrived at the cafe for her shift, Sarah was still fuming. Tessa took one look at her face and raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong? You look like you're ready to bite someone's head off." "Did you know?" Sarah demanded. "About my medical debt being paid off?" Tessa's expression softened with understanding. "Ah, I had a feeling this might happen." "So you did know," Sarah said, her suspicions confirmed. "Did he tell you to keep it from me?" "No," Tessa replied firmly. "Mr. Vance didn't tell me anything, but I've worked for him for years, Sarah. I know how he operates. He sees a problem. He fixes it." "It wasn't his problem to fix," Sarah snapped, tying her apron with more force than necessary. "It was mine." "Have you considered," Tessa said gently, "that maybe he just wanted to help? That maybe seeing you struggle with that burden was painful for him?" Sarah fell silent, conflicted. Was it wrong of Cassian to help her? Wasn't that what she would have done if their positions were reversed? If she had the means to ease someone else's suffering, wouldn't she do it? But it was more complicated than that. The debt represented her mother's final illness, her last desperate attempts to save the woman who had raised her alone. It was painful, yes, but it was also deeply personal. Having it erased by someone else's checkbook felt like having a piece of her history wiped away without her consent. That evening, Cassian texted to ask if she wanted to meet for dinner. Sarah agreed, knowing they needed to talk face to face. They met at a small park near her apartment, sitting on a bench overlooking a pond where ducks glided peacefully across the water. Cassian brought takeout from her favorite Vietnamese place, but Sarah was too upset to eat. "You paid off my mother's medical debt," she said without preamble. Cassian didn't deny it. "Yes." "Why?" Sarah demanded. "Why would you do something like that without talking to me first?" "Would you have let me if I'd asked?" Cassian countered gently. "No," Sarah admitted, "but that's the point. It was my choice to make." Cassian was quiet for a moment, feeding a piece of bread to a hopeful duck that had waddled up to them. "You're right," he said finally. "I should have respected your autonomy. I'm sorry." His straightforward apology caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected him to defend his actions, to point out how much easier her life would be without the debt hanging over her head. Cassian continued, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent my whole life solving problems with money. It becomes automatic after a while. See issue, apply funds, issue resolved. He looked at her directly. But you're not a problem to be solved, Sarah. You're a person with agency and dignity. I forgot that, and I'm truly sorry. Sarah felt her anger begin to dissipate, replaced by confusion. I just don't understand why you're doing all this. The job, the apartment, now this. What do you want from me, Cassian? Nothing, he said simply. That's what makes this different. Everyone wants something, Sarah replied skeptically. Cassian smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. When you have as much money as I do, people always want something from you. They want your investments, your connections, your influence. They laugh at jokes that aren't funny and agree with opinions they don't share, all to stay in your good graces. He reached out, tentatively taking her hand. You treated me like a normal person that night at the restaurant. You argued with me, challenged me. You didn't care who I was or what I could do for you. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? Sarah looked down at their joined hands, her resolve weakening. I still wish you had asked me first. I promise I won't make decisions for you again, Cassian said solemnly. Your life is yours to control. They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks and the setting sun casting golden light across the pond. Finally, Sarah squeezed his hand. Thank you, she said softly, for my mother's debt. It was a generous thing to do, even if the execution was flawed. Cassian laughed. I'm learning, slowly, but I'm learning. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. Sarah began to trust that Cassian's interest in her was genuine, not motivated by pity or some savior complex. And Cassian learned that helping Sarah didn't mean taking over her life. As summer turned to fall, their relationship deepened. Cassian introduced Sarah to his world in small doses. A gallery opening here, a charity dinner there, always making sure she felt comfortable and respected. Sarah, in turn, showed Cassian parts of the city he'd never experienced despite living there his whole life. Community art spaces, street food markets, a poetry slam in a basement bookstore. At the cafe, Sarah's reputation as an artist continued to grow. What had started as simple sketches on napkins had evolved into a serious side business, with customers commissioning portraits and landscapes, and a waiting list forming for her work. One evening in late September, Cassian arrived at the cafe just as Sarah was finishing her shift. His expression was unusually serious. "Can we talk?" he asked, holding the door open for her as they stepped out into the crisp autumn air. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, concerned by his tone. "Everything's fine," Cassian assured her. "I just have a proposition for you, and I want to be clear that it's completely your decision." They walked to a nearby park where the trees were beginning to turn golden and red. Cassian led her to a bench and took a deep breath before speaking. "I own a building in the arts district," he began. "It's been sitting empty for a while. I've been thinking about turning it into an art gallery and studio space, focusing on emerging artists who need exposure and support." Sarah nodded, not seeing how this related to her. "I'd like you to run it," Cassian continued, "to be the gallery director and have your own studio space there. You have an incredible eye for talent, and your own work deserves a bigger showcase than a cafe wall." Sarah stared at him, stunned. "Cassian, I don't have any experience running a gallery." "You have the passion and the vision," he countered. "The rest can be learned. I've watched how you connect with people through your art, how you help other artists at the community center. You'd be perfect for this." "This sounds like an enormous investment," Sarah said cautiously. "Why would you do this?" "Partly as a business decision," Cassian replied honestly. "The arts district is growing, and a gallery would be a good investment, but mostly because I believe in you and what you could create there." Sarah was silent, processing his offer. It was an incredible opportunity, one that aligned perfectly with her dreams. But something held her back. "Would I be working for you?" she asked finally. "Would you be my boss?" Cassian shook his head. "You'd be an independent director. I'd be the owner of the building and the initial investor, but the gallery would be yours to run as you see fit." "And what about us?" Sarah gestured between them. "Wouldn't this complicate things?" "It might," Cassian admitted, "which is why I want you to take some time to think about it. This isn't a now or never offer. The building isn't going anywhere." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Sarah struggled with the decision. The opportunity was everything she could have wanted professionally, a chance to create art full-time, to help other artists, to build something meaningful. But she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting would somehow change the balance between her and Cassian, making her indebted to him in ways that went beyond money. And there was another concern, one she hadn't voiced to Cassian. She'd overheard customers at the cafe talking about them, speculating about their relationship. "He probably just keeps her around because she's pretty," one woman had said dismissively. "Men like him always have a charity case on the side." The comment had stung more than Sarah wanted to admit. Was that how people saw her? As Cassian's charity case? His pet project? Would running his gallery only reinforce that perception? The next day at the cafe, Sarah was distracted, going through the motions of her job while her mind churned with indecision. During a slow period, she confided in Tessa, explaining Cassian's offer and her reservations. "Do you want my honest opinion?" Tessa asked, wiping down the counter beside her. Sarah nodded. "You're overthinking this," Tessa said bluntly. "If any other wealthy art patron offered you this opportunity, you'd jump at it without all this soul-searching." "But it's not just any patron," Sarah protested. "It's Cassian, the man I'm dating." "Exactly," Tessa replied. "Someone who knows your talent better than anyone. Someone who believes in you enough to invest in your vision." She paused, giving Sarah a knowing look. "The real question is, are you hesitating because you're afraid of the opportunity, or because you're afraid of what accepting it might mean about your feelings for him?" The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Sarah had been careful to keep a certain emotional distance from Cassian, despite their growing closeness. Accepting his help with a job was one thing. Accepting his investment in her future was another level of commitment entirely. That evening, Cassian took her to dinner at an upscale restaurant. His choice this time, though he'd made sure it wasn't overly extravagant. As they finished their meal, Sarah finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her. "I've been thinking about your gallery proposal," she began. Cassian set down his wine glass, giving her his full attention. "And, before I give you my answer, I need to ask you something," Sarah said, gathering her courage. "Why me? There are dozens of established artists and curators in this city who would jump at this opportunity. Why offer it to someone who was homeless a few months ago?" Cassian considered her question carefully. "Do you remember what you said that first night at the restaurant? You compared programming to art, creating solutions from nothing but an idea." Sarah nodded, surprised he remembered such a small detail. "That stayed with me," Cassian continued. "Most people see technology and art as opposites, one logical, one emotional. But you immediately understood the connection between them." He leaned forward. "That's why because you see things differently, because you've lived in both worlds, struggling and now finding your footing. That perspective is valuable, Sarah. It's what will make the gallery special." "I'm afraid," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that if I accept, people will think I'm using you, or that you're using me as some kind of project." "People will always talk," Cassian replied gently. "They'll create narratives that fit their worldview. We can't control that." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "All we can control is the truth between us." "And what is that truth, Cassian?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "The truth is that I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Not with your circumstances or your potential or what helping you says about me. Just you, Serafina Hale, the woman who sat at the wrong table and changed my life." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. No one had ever looked at her the way Cassian was looking at her now, like she was precious and strong all at once. "I haven't decided about the gallery yet," she said finally, "but I am sure about one thing." She squeezed his hand. "I'm falling in love with you too." The admission felt both terrifying and freeing. For months she'd kept a part of herself guarded, afraid to fully trust the fairy tale that had somehow become her life. Afraid that acknowledging her feelings for Cassian would somehow make her vulnerable, dependent. But looking into his eyes now, she realized something important. Love wasn't about erasing the differences between them or pretending they didn't exist. It was about building a bridge across those differences, about choosing each other despite them. Later that week, Sarah finally gave Cassian her answer about the gallery. She would accept his offer, but with conditions. She would repay his investment over time. She would maintain creative control, and they would keep their personal relationship separate from their professional one as much as possible. Cassian agreed to everything without hesitation, relief and joy evident in his face. Together, they began planning the renovation of the building, transforming the empty space into a gallery that would showcase emerging artists alongside Sarah's own work. What Sarah didn't know was that as she was embracing this new chapter in her life, forces were gathering that threatened to tear apart everything she and Cassian had built. His board of directors was growing concerned about his distraction. Gossip columns were starting to take notice of the millionaire tech CEO dating a former homeless woman, and Cassian himself was keeping one final secret that, when revealed, would test their relationship to its breaking point. But for now, in the warm glow of new love and exciting possibilities, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the future they were creating together. A future where her past hardships weren't erased, but were instead transformed into the foundation for something beautiful and unexpected. Wintertime arrived, bringing with it a flurry of activity. The gallery renovations were progressing rapidly, with Cassian's team working to transform the abandoned building into Sarah's vision. She'd thrown herself into the project, spending hours poring over floor plans, lighting designs, and marketing strategies. The gallery, which she had named Second Chance, was scheduled to open in the spring with a showcase of local artists who, like Sarah, had faced significant obstacles in their careers. While Sarah continued to work at the cafe, she spent every spare moment preparing for the gallery opening. She'd begun reaching out to artists in shelters and community centers, looking for hidden talents who deserved recognition. The response had been overwhelming, with dozens of submissions coming in daily. Cassian supported her vision completely, providing resources without trying to control the creative direction. Their relationship had deepened in the months since their mutual confession of love, with Sarah gradually becoming more comfortable in Cassian's world of wealth and privilege. One snowy evening in late January, Cassian stopped by the cafe just as Sarah was closing up. He looked unusually formal in a tailored tuxedo, his dark hair styled perfectly, a contrast to the casual sweaters and jeans he typically wore around her. "Don't you look fancy?" Sarah teased, locking the cafe door behind her. "Hot date tonight?" "Actually, yes," Cassian replied with a smile, pulling an envelope from his pocket and handing it to her. "With you, I hope." Sarah opened the envelope to find an invitation to the annual Tech Innovation Charity Gala, one of the city's most prestigious events. According to the elegant card, it was being held that very evening at the Grand Plaza Hotel. "Cassian," she said hesitantly, "this starts in an hour. I'm not dressed for a gala." "I took the liberty of having something delivered to your apartment," Cassian said. "If you'd like to attend, that is. I know it's last minute." "Why is it last minute?" Sarah asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "You must have known about this event for weeks." Cassian had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I did. I wasn't sure if you'd be comfortable attending something like this. These galas can be intimidating." "You mean you weren't sure if I'd embarrass you in front of your rich friends?" Sarah said, immediately regretting the words as hurt flashed across Cassian's face. "That's not it at all," he said quietly. "I was trying to protect you from how overwhelming these events can be. The scrutiny, the gossip, but I realized I was making decisions for you again, and I promised I wouldn't do that." Sarah softened, reaching up to straighten his bow tie. "You're right. It should be my choice. So, let me choose now. Yes, I'll come to your fancy gala." Relief and happiness spread across Cassian's features. "You will?" "On one condition," Sarah added. "Promise me you won't leave my side all night." "I promise," Cassian said solemnly, bringing her hand to his lips. "My car is waiting. Shall we stop by your apartment to get ready?" An hour later, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The dress Cassian had sent over was a midnight blue floor-length gown that fit her perfectly, with delicate silver beadwork that caught the light when she moved. It was elegant without being ostentatious, exactly the kind of thing she would have chosen for herself if she'd had unlimited funds. A matching silver clutch contained just enough space for her essentials, and a professional makeup artist Cassian had arranged had transformed her usual simple look into something sophisticated and glamorous. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant updo, a few curls framing her face. As Sarah emerged from the bathroom, Cassian's expression made all the effort worthwhile. He looked at her with such open admiration that she felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "You are absolutely stunning," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Sarah replied, trying to hide her nervousness behind humor. In the car on the way to the hotel, Cassian briefed her on what to expect. "This is a fundraiser for technology education in underserved communities," he explained. "Most of the major tech companies in the city sponsor it, including Vance Technologies. There will be dinner, speeches, an auction, and then dancing." "Will I know anyone there?" Sarah asked, fidgeting with her clutch. "Probably not," Cassian admitted. "But I'll introduce you to people I think you'll like. Just be yourself, Sarah. That's who I want by my side tonight." The Grand Plaza Hotel was ablaze with lights as they pulled up to the entrance. Photographers lined the red carpet leading to the doors, capturing images of the city's elite as they arrived. Sarah felt a moment of panic as the car door opened and camera flashes immediately began popping in their direction. "Cassian," she whispered, freezing halfway out of the car, "you didn't mention photographers?" "Just smile and keep walking," he murmured, taking her arm. "They're more interested in tech celebrities than in me." But that wasn't entirely true. As they made their way up the carpet, Sarah could hear the photographers calling Cassian's name, asking him to turn their way, asking who his date was. Cassian kept his arm firmly around her waist, guiding her forward with a practiced smile on his face. Inside, the ballroom was a vision of elegance, with crystal chandeliers, white-clothed tables, and an orchestra playing softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, weaving between groups of expensively dressed guests. Cassian led Sarah to the bar, ordering champagne for both of them. "You okay?" he asked, studying her face. "Fine," Sarah lied, taking a large sip of her champagne. "Just a bit overwhelmed." "It gets easier," Cassian assured her. "Let me introduce you to some people." The next hour passed in a blur as Cassian guided her from group to group. He introduced her as Serafina Hale, the talented artist who's opening Second Chance Gallery. Some people seemed genuinely interested in hearing about the gallery, asking thoughtful questions about her vision and the artists she planned to feature. Others barely acknowledged her, their eyes sliding away to scan the room for more important connections. Throughout it all, Cassian kept his promise to stay by her side, his hand a reassuring presence at the small of her back. Despite her initial anxiety, Sarah began to relax, even enjoying some of the conversations about art and philanthropy. During dinner, they were seated at a table with several other tech executives and their partners. The conversation flowed easily, with Cassian making sure to include Sarah in discussions where she could contribute. She was starting to think she'd overreacted to the whole situation when she excused herself to visit the ladies' room. As she was washing her hands, two elegantly dressed women entered, chatting animatedly. They didn't seem to notice Sarah at first, continuing their conversation as they checked their makeup in the mirrors. "Did you see who Cassian Vance brought tonight?" one woman asked, applying fresh lipstick. "I don't recognize her at all. Must be new on the scene." "Oh, I heard about her," the second woman replied, her voice dropping to a gossipy whisper. "She was homeless or something. Cassian met her by accident and has been playing fairy godfather ever since. Set her up with a job, an apartment, now apparently a whole art gallery." "How charitable of him," the first woman said with a sarcastic edge. "Men like Cassian always need a project. First it was those coding camps for underprivileged kids. Now it's saving pretty girls from poverty." "Well, she has no idea who she's really dating," the second woman continued. "Cassian Vance, the billionaire. Not millionaire, billionaire. His company just closed that massive government contract last month. Doubled the stock price overnight." Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Billionaire? The word echoed in her head, making her dizzy. She'd known Cassian was wealthy, but this was a different scale entirely. And the way these women were talking about her, like she was just another of Cassian's charity projects, made her stomach churn. "She has no idea she's dating Cassian Vance, the billionaire," the woman had said, as if Cassian being rich was his defining characteristic. As if that was all that mattered about him. But wasn't it? If he'd been just a regular person that night at the restaurant, would he have offered her a job? An apartment? Would he have paid off her mother's medical debt or offered to fund her gallery? Their entire relationship was built on his ability to solve her problems with money. The women finally noticed her standing there and fell silent, exchanging awkward glances before hurrying out. Sarah remained frozen in place, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The elegant stranger looking back at her seemed like a costume now, a role she was playing in someone else's story. She didn't belong here, among these people with their casual cruelty and their lives of effortless privilege. And maybe she didn't belong with Cassian either, this man she apparently barely knew. With shaking hands, Sarah gathered her things and slipped out of the bathroom. Instead of returning to the ballroom, she found a side exit and stepped out into the cold night air. Her thin wrap did little to protect against the winter chill, but she barely felt it through the numbness spreading through her. She began walking, heedless of the direction, her mind churning with the conversation she'd overheard. Everything looked different now, every interaction with Cassian reframed in the harsh light of this new information. How much of their relationship was real, and how much was just part of his project? Was she just the latest in a line of charitable causes? A way for him to feel good about his enormous wealth? After walking several blocks, the cold finally penetrated her shock. Sarah flagged down a taxi, giving the driver her apartment address. As the car pulled away from the curb, her phone began buzzing with texts and calls from Cassian. She turned it off, unable to face him just yet. Back in her apartment, Sarah changed out of the beautiful gown, carefully hanging it up. She washed away the elegant makeup, returning to her real self. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, finally turning her phone back on. Dozens of messages from Cassian filled the screen, growing increasingly concerned. "Where are you? Are you okay? Please let me know you're safe. Sarah, I'm worried. Please call me. I'm checking the hospital now. Please just tell me you're okay." The last message had come just minutes ago. Guilt washed over her. Whatever her feelings about their relationship, she shouldn't have left him frantically searching for her. She typed a quick response. "I'm safe. At home. Need time to think?" His reply was immediate. "Thank God." "Can we talk?" Sarah hesitated, then responded. "Not tonight. I'll call you tomorrow." She turned off her phone again, unable to bear any more communication. The weight of the evening's revelations pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She'd been such a fool, thinking she could build a life with someone from a world so different from her own. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to the cafe for the first time since she'd started working there. She spent the day pacing her small apartment, trying to sort through her jumbled thoughts and emotions. By afternoon, she felt calm enough to finally call Cassian. He answered on the first ring. "Sarah," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Are you okay?" "We need to talk," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can you come to my apartment?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Cassian promised. True to his word, he arrived exactly 20 minutes later, looking disheveled in a way she'd never seen before. His hair was uncombed, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept, and his usual impeccable clothes were replaced by a rumpled sweater and jeans. "Sarah," he began as soon as she opened the door. "I was so worried. What happened last night?" "I overheard some women talking in the bathroom," Sarah said, motioning for him to sit on the small couch while she took the chair opposite. "They were talking about us, about how I was your latest charity project, about how I had no idea I was dating Cassian Vance, the billionaire." Cassian winced. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Is it true?" Sarah asked directly. "Are you a billionaire?" Cassian hesitated, then nodded. "Technically, yes. My company went public last year, and the stock has performed well. But Sarah, that doesn't change anything between us." "It changes everything," Sarah said quietly. "I thought I was dating someone wealthy, yes, but still somewhat in the same reality as me. Someone who might understand struggle, scarcity. But you've never known what it's like to worry about having enough to eat, to choose between medicine and rent." "That's not fair," Cassian protested. "I wasn't born rich, Sarah. I built my company from nothing. I know what it's like to struggle." "But now you have more money than you could spend in a lifetime," Sarah countered. "And I'm just the poor girl you rescued. Your good deed." "Is that really what you think?" Cassian asked, hurt evident in his voice. "That our entire relationship is some kind of charity?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Sarah admitted, tears filling her eyes. "How can we ever be equals when you can solve any problem I have with the equivalent of pocket change to you? You paid off my mother's medical debt without even telling me. You're funding my gallery, my dreams. What do I bring to this relationship except neediness?" "Everything," Cassian said emphatically. "You bring everything, Sarah. Your perspective, your talent, your heart. You make me see the world differently. You challenge me, make me a better person." "But would you be with me if I wasn't your project?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since the previous night. If I was just another woman at that restaurant, with no sad story for you to fix? Yes, Cassian said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. I fell in love with you, Serafina. Not with fixing you or helping you or any of that. Just you. Sarah wanted to believe him, desperately. But the voices of those women in the bathroom echoed in her mind, along with every doubtful thought she'd ever had about their relationship. I need time, she said finally. Time to think about what this means, about whether we can really build something real with such an enormous imbalance between us. What are you saying? Cassian asked, fear creeping into his voice. I'm saying I need space, Sarah replied, standing up to signal the end of the conversation. From you, from the gallery project, from all of it. I need to figure out who I am outside of your influence. Cassian rose slowly, looking as though she'd physically struck him. If that's what you need, I'll respect it. But Sarah, please don't throw away what we have because of what some gossiping women said at a party. What we've built together is real. Maybe, Sarah said, walking to the door, but I need to be sure. As Cassian reached the doorway, he turned back to her. The gallery is still yours, no matter what. No strings attached. It was never about controlling you, Sarah. It was about believing in you. After he left, Sarah sank to the floor, tears flowing freely now. She had just pushed away the man she loved because she was afraid. Afraid of dependency, afraid of inequality, afraid of never knowing if what they had was real or just an elaborate form of charity. The next day, Sarah returned to work at the cafe, throwing herself into the routine to avoid thinking about Cassian. Tessa noticed her subdued mood, but didn't pry, simply squeezing her shoulder in silent support. A week passed with no contact from Cassian. He was respecting her request for space, which somehow made her miss him even more. The gallery renovations continued without her, the construction crew following the plans she'd already approved. 10 days after their confrontation, a letter arrived at Sarah's apartment. Inside was a single key and a note in Cassian's handwriting. The gallery is finished. It's yours, no matter what you decide about us. No strings, no conditions. I believe in your vision, Sarah, even if you no longer believe in ours. See. With trembling hands, Sarah set down the note. The key represented everything she'd dreamed of. Artistic freedom, a platform for her work and the work of others who'd been overlooked. A chance to make a real difference in the art world. But at what cost? Could she accept this gift, knowing it came from a man she'd pushed away? Could she build her future on a foundation that felt like charity? That night, Sarah made her decision. She packed a small bag with essentials, wrote a letter of resignation to Tessa, and left her key to the apartment on the counter. She placed the gallery key and her own letter to Cassian in an envelope, dropping it in his building's mail slot as she passed. I don't need your money. I needed honesty. Goodbye, Cassian. As dawn broke over the city, Sarah boarded a bus heading out of town. She had some savings, enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere she could find her own way, build her own life, without the shadow of Cassian's wealth and influence hanging over her. What she didn't know, as the bus pulled away from the station, was that Cassian was already formulating a plan, one last attempt to prove that his love for her had nothing to do with money and everything to do with believing in her talent, her vision, and the person she truly was. 3 months passed. Sarah had settled in a small coastal town 200 miles away, renting a tiny room above a bookstore and finding work as a waitress at a local diner. The pay was modest, the hours long, but it was honest work that didn't come with strings or complications. In her scarce free time, she'd begun drawing again, selling small sketches to tourists for extra cash. The pain of leaving Cassian had dulled from an acute ache to a persistent throb that flared whenever she saw couples walking hand in hand along the shore, or when customers at the diner mentioned news from the city. She'd cut off all contact, changing her phone number and creating new social media accounts under a variation of her name. It was a clean break, exactly what she'd thought she needed, but in quiet moments, doubt crept in. Had she overreacted? Had she thrown away something precious because of her own insecurities? These questions haunted her, especially at night when the sound of waves crashing against the shore couldn't drown out the memories of Cassian's laugh, his touch, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person he'd ever met. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was covering an extra shift at the diner when her coworker, Maggie, rushed in, shaking water from her umbrella. "You're not going to believe what's happening in town," Maggie said breathlessly. "That old warehouse by the pier? Some rich guy from the city bought it and is turning it into an art gallery. There are construction crews everywhere." Sarah's hand froze in the act of wiping down a table. "An art gallery?" "Yeah, but get this. It's not going to be some fancy place selling expensive art to tourists. The flyers they're handing out say it's for local artists, especially those who faced hardships. They're calling it Second Chance, Harbor Branch." The cloth slipped from Sarah's suddenly numb fingers. Second Chance. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Did you hear who's behind it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Some tech millionaire from the city," Maggie replied with a shrug. "Never caught his name, but they're hiring staff, including a gallery director. You should apply, Sarah. With your art background, you'd be perfect." Sarah mumbled something non-committal and fled to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall as her mind raced. It had to be Cassian. He'd found her. But why? What was he trying to prove? Over the next few days, Sarah watched from a distance as the old warehouse underwent a rapid transformation. Construction crews worked around the clock, turning the dilapidated building into an elegant space with large windows and a modern facade. A sign appeared over the entrance: Second Chance Gallery. Opening soon. Despite her determination to stay away, Sarah found herself drawn to the building, passing by on her way to and from work, watching the progress with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She picked up one of the flyers being distributed around town, which outlined the gallery's mission to showcase artists who had faced significant personal or financial challenges. There was no mention of Cassian Vance anywhere on the flyer. Instead, the contact listed was a woman named Julia Chen, identified as the project manager. A week later, Sarah could no longer resist. She approached the gallery during her afternoon break, peering through the newly installed windows at the pristine white walls and gleaming wooden floors inside. The space was beautiful, simple, elegant, designed to showcase art rather than to impress with ostentation. "Can I help you?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find a woman in her 40s with short black hair and keen eyes, holding a tablet. "I was just looking," Sarah replied. "It's a beautiful space." "Thank you," the woman said with a smile. "I'm Julia Chen, the project manager. We're hoping to open in 3 weeks. Are you an artist?" "I used to be," Sarah admitted. "I studied fine arts in college." "You should consider submitting some work," Julia encouraged. "We're specifically looking for artists with compelling personal stories, people who've overcome obstacles to pursue their passion." "I'll think about it," Sarah said non-committally. "Can I ask, who's funding this project?" "The flyer doesn't say." Julia hesitated briefly. "The investor prefers to remain anonymous. They believe the focus should be on the artists, not on who's providing the financial backing." "I see," Sarah said, her suspicions confirmed. This was exactly like Cassian, creating opportunities while trying to stay in the background. "And what happens after the gallery opens? Will the anonymous investor be running things?" "Not at all," Julia replied. "Once we're operational, ownership of the gallery will be transferred to a local arts collective, with a board made up of community members and artists. The investor is providing the startup funds and the building, but after that, it belongs to the community." Sarah blinked in surprise. This was different. This wasn't Cassian creating another situation where he held the power. This was him giving something away, no strings attached. "That's unusual," she managed to say. Julia smiled. "Yes, it is. I've worked on many philanthropic projects, but this one is special. The investor was very clear that this needed to be genuinely empowering for the community, not just a vanity project." As Sarah walked back to the diner, her mind was in turmoil. This gallery, so similar to the one they had planned together, yet fundamentally different in its ownership structure, felt like a message from Cassian, a way of showing her that he'd listened to her concerns about power imbalance, about charity versus genuine support. But why here? Had he followed her? The thought made her uncomfortable, until she remembered that her letter of resignation to Tessa had mentioned the coast, her desire to be near the ocean. Perhaps that had been enough of a clue. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah watched the gallery's progress, still keeping her distance, but growing increasingly curious. Posters appeared around town announcing an open call for submissions for the inaugural exhibition, with the theme Resilience and Renewal. Despite her resolve to avoid anything connected to Cassian, Sarah found herself pulling out her sketchbook one night, working until dawn on a piece she couldn't deny was meant for the exhibition. It was a portrait, not of Cassian, as her fingers had initially itched to draw, but of herself, a self-portrait showing her as she had been that night at the restaurant, rainwater dripping from her hair, hope and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. The woman who had sat at the wrong table and had her life changed forever. On the day submissions were due, Sarah stood outside the gallery for nearly an hour, her carefully wrapped artwork clutched to her chest, debating whether to enter. Finally, just minutes before the deadline, she pushed open the door and handed her piece to Julia without a word of explanation. The opening night of Second Chance Gallery arrived on a perfect spring evening. The entire town seemed to turn out for the event, curious about the transformation of the old warehouse and the art it now contained. Sarah had received an official invitation as a contributing artist, but had almost decided not to attend, afraid of what or who she might find there. In the end, the pull was too strong to resist. She put on her nicest dress, nothing like the elegant gown from the charity gala, but a simple blue sundress that brought out the color of her eyes, and walked to the gallery, her heart pounding with each step. The space was packed with people, the white walls now adorned with an eclectic mix of paintings, photographs, and sculptures. Soft music played in the background, and waiters circulated with trays of champagne and appetizers. Sarah accepted a glass of champagne, using it as a shield as she made her way through the crowd, scanning faces, looking for the one she both longed for and dreaded seeing. Her self-portrait hung on the most prominent wall, positioned so it was the first thing visitors saw when they entered. Beside it was a small placard with her name and the title she'd given the piece, The Wrong Table. There was no price listed. Instead, the placard simply read, Not for Sale. As Sarah stood studying her own work, wondering who had made the decision to feature it so prominently, a familiar voice spoke softly from behind her. It's the best piece in the show. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Her body recognized his voice before her mind did, a shiver running down her spine at the sound. Cassian, she said, finally turning to face him. He looked different, thinner, with a beard he hadn't had before, and casual clothes that were a far cry from his usual tailored suits. But his eyes were the same, that intense blue-gray that seemed to see right through to her soul. "Hello, Sarah," he said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the crowded gallery fading away until it felt like they were alone in their own private bubble. "So, this is your grand gesture," Sarah finally said, gesturing around at the gallery. "Following me to a new town, building another gallery." "Not quite," Cassian replied. "The gallery isn't the gesture, it's what comes with it." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers to find a legal document. As she scanned the contents, her eyes widened in shock. "You're giving me the gallery?" she whispered. "Not exactly," Cassian corrected gently. "I'm giving it to the community, with you named as the inaugural director if you want the position. No strings attached, the building, the startup funds, everything. It's all being transferred to a community trust. I will have no ownership, no control, no say in how it's run." "Why?" Sarah asked, searching his face. "Why go to all this trouble?" "Because you were right," Cassian said simply. "About everything. The imbalance between us, the way my money affected our relationship. I couldn't see it before because wealth has been part of my identity for so long. But these past months without you have been—" He paused, struggling for words. "Clarifying. So you built this gallery, away from your business empire, away from your wealth and influence," Sarah said slowly, beginning to understand. "A place where your talent and vision can flourish without my shadow hanging over it," Cassian confirmed. "Where you can build something that's entirely yours, not a gift from me." Sarah was speechless, the document still clutched in her hands. "There's something else," Cassian continued, guiding her gently away from the crowd to a quieter corner. "I've made some changes in my life, too." "What kind of changes?" Sarah asked, curiosity piqued. "I've stepped down as CEO of Vance Technologies," Cassian said. "I'm still on the board, but I've handed over day-to-day operations to my team. I've also established a foundation that will manage most of my wealth, with a board of directors who share my values but aren't beholden to me personally." "You gave up your company?" Sarah was stunned. "Why would you do that?" "Because you helped me see that there's more to life than acquisition and control," Cassian replied. "I built a technology empire, but at what cost? I had no real connections, no one who saw me as just Cassian, not as a billionaire or a CEO or an investor." His eyes held hers. "No one except you." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Cassian assured her. "This isn't about getting you back. I didn't build this gallery as a way to manipulate you into forgiving me. I did it because your vision of supporting artists who've faced hardships deserves to exist in the world. And if you want me to leave tonight and never contact you again, I'll respect that." Sarah studied his face, searching for any hint of manipulation or ulterior motive, but all she saw was sincerity, vulnerability, and a weariness that suggested these past months had been as difficult for him as they had been for her. "Wait here," she said suddenly, making a decision. "I'll be right back." Sarah hurried through the crowded gallery to the small office in the back where she'd stored her bag. From it, she withdrew a folder containing a sketch she'd finished just days ago, but hadn't included in the exhibition. Returning to Cassian, she handed it to him wordlessly. He opened the folder carefully and stilled, his breath catching. Inside was a portrait of him, not the polished billionaire in a tailored suit, but the man she'd first met at the restaurant, with kind eyes and an intrigued smile as he looked at something beyond the frame. At her. "I drew this from memory," Sarah said softly. "This is how I see you, Cassian. Not as a wealthy benefactor or a CEO, but as the man who sat across from me that night and looked at me like I mattered." Cassian traced the lines of the drawing with a gentle finger, emotion welling in his eyes. "This is who I want to be," he whispered. "Just a man, worthy of being seen by you." "No more lies?" Sarah asked, taking a step closer to him. "Only truth," Cassian promised. "Always." "Then the truth is, I've missed you," Sarah admitted, her voice barely audible above the gallery noise. "I've thought about you every day, about us." "I've missed you too," Cassian said, "more than I knew was possible." They stood there in the crowded gallery, surrounded by art and people, but seeing only each other. Slowly, hesitantly, Cassian reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face, giving her the choice to pull away. Instead, Sarah closed the distance between them, leaning into his touch as his palm cupped her cheek. The contact sent a wave of warmth through her, familiar and new all at once. "I don't want the gallery," she said suddenly. Pain flashed across Cassian's face, but he nodded in acceptance. "I understand." "No, you don't," Sarah continued, a small smile playing at her lips. "I don't want the gallery as a peace offering or a separation agreement. I want to build it with you, as equals, not as your charity case or your project, but as your partner." Hope dawned in Cassian's eyes. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I want a second chance," Sarah replied, "for both of us, to see if we can build something real, something balanced, where your wealth is just one aspect of who you are, not the defining thing between us." Instead of answering with words, Cassian leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that asked permission even as it expressed everything he couldn't say. Sarah responded with a kiss of her own, wrapping her arms around his neck, not caring who might be watching in the crowded gallery. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Cassian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Serafina Hale," he said softly. "Not for what you need or what I can give you, but for who you are." "And I love you, Cassian Vance," Sarah replied, "not for your money or your power, but for your heart." As they stood there in the gallery named for new beginnings, surrounded by art that told stories of resilience and hope, Sarah knew that their path forward wouldn't be simple. There would still be imbalances to navigate, misunderstandings to overcome, a world that would try to define them by their different backgrounds. But they had something stronger now, a foundation built on honesty, mutual respect, and the knowledge that they had both been willing to walk away rather than compromise what mattered most. Outside the gallery windows, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. Cassian took Sarah's hand, and together they walked out into the evening air, leaving behind the noise and bustle of the opening, seeking a moment of quiet to begin again. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they strolled along the pier, the sound of waves crashing beneath them. "Whatever we want," Cassian replied. "The gallery here, the one in the city, my foundation, they're all just possibilities, not obligations. We can build something new, something that's truly ours." "I like the sound of that," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "Something that's ours." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cassian and Sarah stood at the edge of the pier, looking out at the vast ocean stretching before them. It seemed a fitting metaphor for the future they now faced, full of possibility, sometimes turbulent, but beautiful in its boundlessness. "No more lies?" Sarah asked again, turning to look up at him. "Only love," Cassian replied, gathering her into his arms as the last light of day faded into night, making way for a new beginning. In the years that followed, Second Chance Gallery would grow into a network of community art spaces across the country, each one dedicated to artists who had faced significant challenges. Sarah would develop into a respected curator and artist in her own right, while Cassian would find purpose in using his business acumen to support causes that created genuine opportunity rather than dependent charity. Their story would inspire others, not because it was a fairy tale about a homeless girl and a billionaire, but because it was a testament to the power of honesty, mutual respect, and the courage to build relationships based on seeing each other for who they truly are, not for the circumstances that brought them together. And it all began with a simple mistake, a young woman sitting at the wrong table on a rainy night, changing the course of two lives forever. If you enjoyed this heart-touching story of love, honesty, and second chances, please like and share. Let me know in the comments where you're reading from. I'd love to connect with you all.